17 engineers. 2 days, millions of yen lost. And then a delivery girl walked in. They laughed at her until she sat down, and everything changed. Ananya Rao still remembers the scent of incense and cardamom in the air that morning in Mumbai when she said goodbye to her parents at the airport gate. Her mother cried quietly behind a navy blue sari, trying not to let the tears fall onto the brand new suitcase Ananya was carrying. Her father, always serious, said only one sentence before she boarded. "Don't forget why you went there, beta. Make us proud." It was impossible to forget. She had dreamed of this moment since she was 12, watching a documentary about Tokyo and promising herself that one day she would see those lights up close. Not as a tourist, but as someone who belonged. After years of sleepless nights, crushing exams, and brutal competition, she earned a place at IIT Bombay, graduating at the top of her class. To set herself apart even more, she applied for a master's in distributed systems at the University of Tokyo. When the acceptance letter arrived, her family nearly burst with pride. Japan is where technology meets the future. They will value you more than here. But no one spoke about the silence. The silence was the first thing that struck her when she left Narita Airport. The silence of the people on the train. The silence of the university corridors. The silence during job interviews, when managers' eyes slid past her as though she were made of glass. At first, she convinced herself it was just a phase, that she just needed to learn more Japanese, that she just needed to send more resumes. 57 applications in the first 3 weeks. 0 responses. After finishing her degree, she walked through the streets of Shinjuku wearing her best blue suit, keeping her heels in her bag to avoid blistering her feet, dreaming of a glass-walled office on the 28th floor of some tower, her name etched on a plaque next to the door. What she found instead were sterile white corridors, neutral voices, and smiles that lasted only long enough to refuse her. "We're looking for someone with more experience, perhaps someone more familiar with our corporate culture." With her savings dwindling and too ashamed to call home for help, she took what she could get, a job delivering electronic equipment. The pay was just enough for a small room in Nishikasai and a train pass. The hours were long, the stairs heavier than the boxes she carried. She cycled through Tokyo's streets with a yellow backpack that read Sokotatsu, express delivery, balancing expensive packages on her back while staring up at the buildings she once dreamed of working in, wondering if anyone would ever know who she really was. There were days she thought of going back to India, days when the summer humidity clung to her skin, the vacant stares of fellow passengers on the train suffocated her, and the loneliness felt bigger than the whole city. But whenever she thought of giving up, she remembered her father's words, "Don't forget why you went there." And then, on that rainy morning when she got the notification to pick up an urgent delivery for a company in the heart of Marunouchi, she expected nothing but another cold corridor, another stamped receipt, another arigato gozaimasu without eye contact. She didn't know that building, the 14th floor of that building, would be the place where her invisibility would finally be challenged, and where she would have the chance to prove, to them and to herself, who she really was. She thought rejection was the worst thing, until she saw what waited on the 14th floor that morning. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, but what awaited her on the 14th floor was anything but soft. The air hit her first, thick, heavy, smelling faintly of burnt coffee and exhaustion. The office was vast, lined with glass walls and blinking screens, but today it didn't look like a place of innovation. It looked like a battlefield. 17 engineers sat at their desks and on the floor, hunched over laptops and piles of printouts, their ties loosened, their hair disheveled, their faces drawn. Some stared blankly at code on their screens. Others whispered to each other in clipped Japanese, fingers still hammering at their keyboards as if trying to beat the system into submission. At the center of it all stood a man in a sharp navy suit, his gray hair mussed, his jaw clenched as he barked into a phone, pacing between two glowing dashboards that displayed nothing but angry red error messages and plummeting numbers. The CEO, she guessed. Hi, we understand. We are doing everything possible, he muttered into the phone, though his tone suggested he was saying it more for himself than the person on the other end. When he hung up, his shoulders slumped slightly before squaring again. Ananya stood near the reception desk, clutching her delivery clipboard, unsure where to go. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman who looked equally overwhelmed, waved her toward a low counter without looking up, juggling 3 ringing phones. "You can leave it there," she said flatly. Ananya hesitated. "I'm sorry, but this is expensive equipment. Protocol requires me to get a signature from the technical lead." The woman finally looked at her then, her eyes bloodshot and impatient. "Everyone is busy saving the company, miss. Just leave it." Ananya glanced past her at the glass-walled conference room where executives stood around a large table arguing over charts on enormous monitors. The words on the screens leapt out at her. 504 gateway timeout. Connection failed. Database pool maxed out. They weren't just errors, they were familiar. Patterns she'd studied, patterns she'd written about in her thesis. "What's happening?" she asked softly, almost to herself. The receptionist exhaled harshly. "The system's been down for 2 days. Every hour we lose millions of yen. Clients are threatening to walk. If they don't fix it by tomorrow, this place might not even exist." Ananya swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. The weight in the air wasn't just tension, it was desperation. 17 engineers, 48 hours, and still failure. She looked at the screens again, at the sea of numbers and errors flowing across them like blood through a wounded body. It was chaos, but it wasn't meaningless. Not to her. "I'll wait for the lead," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The receptionist muttered something under her breath, but pointed to a row of black leather chairs by the glass wall. "Suit yourself." Ananya sat, placing her backpack at her feet, and tried to look anywhere but at the eyes that occasionally glanced her way, briefly, then dismissed her presence. Through the glass, she could see the CEO gesturing furiously as his team spoke over one another, and all the while, the numbers on the screens behind him kept falling. It wasn't her place to care. She was just the girl with the backpack. But she couldn't stop herself from thinking, 17 engineers, and not one of them sees it yet? But then she couldn't stop herself, and they heard her. It began almost by accident. When the engineer with the clipboard finally approached her, a man in his 30s, shirt sleeves rolled up, a thin sheen of sweat on his temples. He didn't even look at her directly. "You, delivery girl, you have the processors?" he asked, his voice tight with fatigue. Ananya nodded quickly, opening her yellow backpack to reveal 3 sealed boxes. "Yes, sir, 3 units. Please sign here," she said, offering the clipboard. He snatched the boxes with surprising reverence, placing them on a rolling cart as though they were delicate artifacts. But when she held out the pen for his signature, he hesitated, clearly impatient, and muttered, "We're replacing the main processors to force a full reboot. Should have done this yesterday." Ananya's brows furrowed, but she kept her voice soft. "You're rebooting the system entirely without identifying what's causing the timeout?" The man froze mid-step. His head tilted slightly, just enough to look at her out of the corner of his eye. "What did you say?" Her throat tightened. "I noticed the 540 errors on the screens. Sometimes it's not the hardware. It can be cascading timeouts on microservices. You might want to..." He turned fully now, eyes narrowing. Then he laughed, a sharp, humorless laugh that carried across the room. "Of course, the delivery girl has diagnosed the problem. 17 engineers, 2 days of work, and we never thought to ask you." A few heads nearby lifted. Someone snorted. Another engineer murmured something under his breath. She caught the word gaijin, and then silence again, heavy and mocking. "I didn't mean it that way," she whispered. "No? Then how did you mean it?" the man shot back. His voice rose slightly. "Do you think we're all idiots? Do you think we wouldn't check the basics? We have analyzed every line of code, every configuration, every single parameter. Do you really believe you're smarter than everyone here?" Her cheeks burned hot. She gripped the strap of her bag like it could anchor her to the floor. I wasn't suggesting," she tried. "Yes, you were." His tone turned cutting now, each word like a blade. "You've been standing here for what, 10 minutes? You read a few error codes and suddenly you're an expert? Don't insult us. Go back to your deliveries." A few others chuckled again, low, cruel. One of the engineers, a younger man near the corner, shook his head slowly, muttering in Japanese. "Outsiders always think they know better. Always." Ananya stood still, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every part of her told her to lower her eyes, apologize, and leave. But something in her, something stubborn, something proud, refused to move. Instead, she lifted her gaze and held it on him, even as he scoffed and turned to leave. That's when she noticed the CEO standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, his face drawn. He had been watching the entire exchange, silent. For a moment, the entire room seemed to notice him at once, and the whispers died instantly. The engineer stopped, his back straightening, as he turned to face his boss. "What's going on here?" the CEO asked evenly, though there was a dangerous undercurrent beneath his calm. The engineer's voice faltered slightly. "She suggested the errors could be due to cascading timeouts on microservices. I explained that we've already checked everything, sir." The CEO's sharp eyes moved to Ananya and stayed there. The silence stretched so long it became unbearable. Her breath came shallow. She felt every set of eyes in the room boring into her, some hostile, some curious, some indifferent, but all waiting for her to flinch, to retreat. "Why would you say that?" the CEO finally asked. She licked her lips. "Because sometimes the simplest explanations are overlooked. When systems fail progressively instead of instantly, it's usually a resource starvation issue rather than hardware." He raised an eyebrow just slightly. "And you know this how?" I wrote my thesis on distributed system optimization at the University of Tokyo, sir." Another sharp laugh, not from the CEO, but from the engineer beside her. "Oh, a thesis. Well, we must all stand corrected. You wrote a thesis, so clearly, enough." The CEO's voice cut through the laughter like steel, and the room went quiet again. But she didn't know yet. This silence was only the beginning. The silence hung in the room, thick and oppressive. The CEO's eyes were still on her, his expression impossible to read. Not contempt, not amusement, something closer to calculation. "So, University of Tokyo," he finally said. His Japanese was precise, but he switched to English as he approached her, perhaps for her benefit or perhaps to test her. "You are an engineer, then?" Ananya nodded, unsure whether to speak. "Yes, master's in distributed systems." "And yet you are delivering packages." It wasn't even a question, more like an indictment. Behind him, she could hear a few quiet snickers from the engineers. Even the receptionist looked away, embarrassed for her. "Yes, sir," she admitted, her cheeks flushing, but her voice stayed even. The market, it's difficult for foreigners. I needed to work. The CEO's gaze didn't waver. You make it sound as though this country is at fault for your choices. That stung. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Tell me, Miss Rao? Rao, yes. Miss Rao, do you know what's at stake here? She glanced at the glowing screens around the room, numbers bleeding red, angry error codes multiplying like wounds. It seems you're losing clients, revenue, reputation. We are losing everything, he said bluntly. 17 engineers, 2 days, 48 hours of no sleep. Every hour that passes, we bleed another 100 million yen. Clients are canceling contracts. The board is circling. And now you arrive with a delivery and offer us advice. His tone sharpened as he spoke, the steel in his words more pronounced now. Do you understand what that looks like, Miss Rao? You stand there, having worked here for, what, 2 minutes, and suggest my engineers are incompetent? The words hit her like stones, but she kept her chin lifted. I never said they were incompetent, sir, only that sometimes a fresh perspective. A fresh perspective. He let out a laugh this time, quiet and cold. That's what you call it. Is that what they taught you at the University of Tokyo? The room was suffocating now. Every pair of eyes watched her, some with curiosity, some with quiet contempt, some with outright hostility. She could feel her heart racing, but she held his gaze. No, sir. What they taught me was how to solve problems, and from what I can see, this is a solvable problem. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. And then something in his expression shifted, just a fraction, from irritation to something darker. Very well, he said, his voice dropping lower. You believe you see something 17 engineers have missed. You believe you are smarter, more capable, more observant. Is that correct? No, sir, she started. But you do. The room seemed to shrink as he stepped closer. Fine. He gestured to an empty terminal at the far end of the room. Sit. Show us. You have 30 minutes. If you're so smart, then fix it. Gasps rippled through the engineers behind him, quiet but unmistakable. Some exchanged incredulous looks. One muttered under his breath in Japanese. Unbelievable, letting her touch the system. The CEO didn't flinch. 30 minutes, Ms. Rao. If you succeed, I will listen. If you fail, you leave, and you never return. Her breath caught in her throat. 30 minutes. She looked at the terminal, at the blinking red monitors, at the 17 engineers staring at her, daring her to try, waiting for her to fail. She thought again of her father's words echoing in her mind. Don't forget why you went there. Slowly, she set down her backpack, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the terminal. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, the weight of every eye in the room pressed on her back like lead. With nothing left to lose, she sat down. The chair was cold when she sat down, and the keyboard felt heavier than it should have. The terminal in front of her glowed with rows upon rows of logs, numbers, and error codes. And behind her, the weight of 17 skeptical eyes bore into her spine. To her left, the CEO crossed his arms, checking his watch. 29 minutes, he murmured. Ananya closed her eyes for a breath, blocking out the whispers already circling the room. This is madness, someone muttered in Japanese. She's going to break something. Let's just get back to work and stop wasting time. She heard every word, and she ignored them all. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Then they began to move. First, she pulled up the system logs from the last 72 hours, thousands upon thousands of lines scrolling past her eyes like a waterfall. She scanned for the first occurrence of the 504 errors. Timestamp? 2 days ago, 03:14 a.m. They'd started intermittently, then climbed steadily, becoming more frequent until the entire system choked under their weight. Classic resource starvation, she thought. Her hands moved faster now, pulling metrics from the database connection pools, then the gateway request queues. One screen showed CPU usage, steady. Another showed memory, stable. Hardware wasn't the problem. Someone scoffed behind her. "She's just scrolling through logs. This is pointless." She clenched her jaw, but didn't stop. Her eyes darted from screen to screen, searching for a pattern. The minutes bled away too quickly. 25 minutes, the CEO announced dryly. Her palms began to sweat. Every few seconds she wiped them on her skirt. She tried to block out the sound of the engineers whispering to each other, of one tapping his pen impatiently, of another sighing loudly as if to remind her of how unwelcome she was. "You don't belong here." That thought came unbidden, but she buried it quickly. Find the pattern. She enlarged the timeline of requests and failures. There. Something glimmered. The errors didn't appear random. They rose in waves, spikes every 2 hours and 15 minutes, like clockwork. Not a hardware failure, not random noise, a cycle. Her fingers moved faster now, pulling the logs that corresponded to the spikes. She noticed another anomaly. Every time the spike occurred, a particular report generation job kicked off. A batch process. Her heart beat faster. 20 minutes. Her breath caught as she traced the job further. With each spike, the number of open database connections climbed and climbed, but never came back down. The connections stayed alive, or rather, they stayed orphaned connections. She froze. Orphaned connections. Of course. She glanced up at the pool metrics again. Available connections? 0. Even though usage was low, they weren't being closed properly. The engineers had been looking at the system as a monolith, rebooting hardware, replacing processors, but the failure was quieter, smaller, and deadlier than that. 15 minutes, came the voice of the CEO. But now there was something different in his tone. Less mocking. More curious. She heard someone behind her shift, uncomfortably. One engineer leaned closer to watch her screen. "What's she doing?" someone whispered. "That pattern. Is that—" But she didn't answer. Her fingers flew over the keys now, tracing the bug to a specific function inside the reporting service, one of the microservices no one seemed to have bothered to check. Line after line of code flashed on the screen till she stopped. There it was. A single return statement inside an exception handler, bypassing the finally block that should have closed the connections. Her pulse thundered in her ears. 10 minutes, the CEO said. But now he was standing closer, watching, silent. Ananya leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Her eyes scanned the screen one last time, confirming what she already knew. Then she began typing. A new finally block, an aggressive timeout for the orphaned connections, a patch for the batch job to release its resources properly. The whispers behind her quieted. The room became still, except for the rhythmic clatter of her keys. She held her breath and typed. The final keystroke echoed in the silence. Ananya leaned back slightly, her fingers finally still. On the screens in front of her, the revised code glowed faintly, waiting to be deployed. She turned her head just enough to catch the CEO's gaze. He was already watching her, arms still crossed, but no longer in defiance. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the tension buzzing in her chest. The CEO nodded once and motioned toward the lead engineer, the same one who'd mocked her minutes ago. "Deploy it," he ordered. The engineer hesitated, his jaw tight, but he stepped forward and slid into the terminal beside her. "If this crashes the system completely," he began. "It won't," she cut in. Calm, firm. He glanced at her,
almost startled by her certainty, then executed the deploy command. The room seemed to hold its breath as the system shut down, just for a moment, before rebooting under her corrected code. The red error screens blinked, stuttered, and began to change. First, the CPU graphs leveled out. Then, the database connection pool began to empty properly, freeing resources. One by one, the angry 504 errors disappeared from the monitors, replaced by streams of successful transactions. Green lights bloomed across the dashboards like tiny signals of life returning to a dying patient. No one spoke. Not at first. Then, the youngest engineer let out an audible gasp. "It's stabilizing," he whispered. "No errors for over a minute now," someone else murmured. 2 minutes, another added, eyes wide at the screen. The tension in the room broke like a wave. A collective exhale swept through the engineers. One even laughed, a startled, relieved sound that quickly spread. The CEO straightened, his sharp eyes scanning the room, then settling back on her. He stepped closer, stopping just behind her chair. "You did it," he said simply. Ananya kept her gaze on the monitors, watching the system hold steady, green light after green light glowing back at her. "We did it," she replied quietly. "I just showed you what to look for."
The engineers, the same ones who had smirked, scoffed, and muttered, now stood silently, some with arms crossed, others rubbing the back of their necks, still processing what had just happened. One of them, the older engineer who had laughed loudest earlier, cleared his throat and muttered, "Well, lucky guess, maybe." But even his voice lacked conviction. Ananya finally stood, pushing the chair back gently. Her knees felt strangely light, her hands almost shaking, not from fear anymore, but from the flood of adrenaline finally subsiding. The CEO extended his hand to her. She hesitated, then shook it. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low but firm. "And a job." The murmurs behind her grew louder at that, but he ignored them. "You saw what 17 engineers missed in 48 hours. I don't care what your resume says. Starting today, you work here. Senior Systems Engineer. Report directly to me." Her chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. For a beat, she said nothing, afraid that if she spoke too soon, she might break whatever fragile spell she had just cast. Then she nodded. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. "But I didn't just fix your system." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Her eyes swept the room, at every stunned, silent face watching her. "I fixed the way you see people like me." But for her, this was about more than a job. 3 months later, the same office looked different. The walls were still glass. The monitors still blinked with endless streams of code and data. The engineers still worked quietly at their stations. But now, when Ananya walked through the room, they looked up. They nodded. They even stopped her sometimes to ask for her insight, her approval, her guidance. She still carried herself the same way, calm, unassuming, deliberate, but she no longer wore her employee badge, clipped neatly to her blazer, her name printed in sharp black letters. Ananya Rao, Senior Systems Engineer. It hadn't been easy. After the system stabilized that day, the CEO kept his word. He hired her on the spot and gave her full authority to audit the company's critical systems. But she asked for something else too. "Let me help find others like me," she'd told him. "Others you overlook." He'd studied her for a moment before replying, "You want to change more than the code." "Yes," she'd said simply. So she built something new, a program called Hidden Talent, designed to identify and recruit skilled professionals who had been ignored by traditional hiring filters. Foreigners, women, young engineers without proper experience, people who knew what it felt like to be invisible. Not anymore. Now she was the one reviewing resumes, leading interviews, mentoring recruits. And when they came into her office, nervous, clutching their folders, eyes flickering with doubt, she smiled at them and said, "I know exactly how you feel. Sit down. Let's talk."
One by one, she brought them in. Engineers from India, China, Vietnam, Brazil, who were just as brilliant, just as overlooked. She taught them what she had learned that night, that competence is not always recognized at first glance, but it always leaves a trace for those who know where to look. And as the months passed, the company's systems grew stronger. So did its people. At the next company-wide meeting, the CEO stood before the staff and spoke plainly. "We almost lost everything that week, but because of one person, someone none of us saw coming, we not only recovered, but became better. Let her story remind us what happens when we underestimate the quiet ones, the outsiders." Ananya sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, feeling her chest tighten as the room applauded. But she wasn't thinking of herself. She was thinking of the delivery girl she used to be, the one gripping the strap of her bag, standing invisible in a room full of engineers who never saw her. "That day they told me, 'If you're so smart, then fix it,'" she thought. And I did. Not just the system, but the way they see people like me. How many brilliant minds have we overlooked because they didn't fit the mold? How many delivery girls are still waiting for someone to see them? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe the quiet ones deserve a chance to prove themselves, subscribe to the channel, because here we tell the stories no one else will.